Welcome to the Emerging Biotech Leader, where we help biotech leaders maximize the value of their therapeutics from translational development to product launch. We're your hosts. I'm Kim Kushner.
And I'm Ramin Farhood. We are here to help you navigate the pitfalls of the biotech industry and illuminate the path forward.
Welcome to today's episode of the Emerging Biotech Leader. I'm so glad to welcome my colleague, Dr. Marcia de Souza Lima, who is a leader in our European practice, but also has really spent a lot of time early in her career working on company formation. We're going to be talking a lot today about a lot of the insights from a prior episode with Al Beardsley, the CEO of Sirius Therapeutics. And in that episode, we talked a lot about what it took to build a company from scratch. In his episode, he talked a lot about the 5 Ps. Today, we'll explore those a little bit further, but also consider adding a few more Ps to the list that we might want to consider in the early days of company formation. Marcia, thank you so much for joining today.
Thank you for having me, Kim.
Of course. To jump right in, maybe you can give us a little bit of your own background. You've had a really interesting path to where we are now, and between clinical practice, moving into the company formation stages. You've worked in a few different spaces. Can you give a brief overview of your background?
Yes. So I'm a physician, an ophthalmologist, actually, and I've practiced for about 10 years before starting working in the industry. I worked in big companies such as Pfizer, Novartis, and mid-sized companies in ophthalmology such as Bausch Lomb. I work for Shire Pharmaceuticals. I've currently based in Switzerland, where I came to work for Shire. But particularly since the pandemic, I've been mostly focused on startup companies. And I've also worked on fundraising, and I am a venture partner and also an investment company.
Amazing. So you've done a little bit of everything really to get to this stage. And having come from big pharma and coming from clinical practice, and I'm sure you can tell a lot of war stories of what it takes to really get a biotech up and running. But before we jump into some of the prior insights, maybe you can give some of your own thoughts or feedback about what it takes to get a company off the ground, really in that earliest days of company formation. What are some of the insights or learnings that you've had really over the last 5 or so years that you've been working on this?
Like I'll mention in the podcast, everything starts with the product, right? Many of these companies come out of universities, of academic labs. But, despite the scientific innovation, what you basically need to have is a product that has a value and a positioning in the market. Sometimes there's incredible scientific innovations, but if you can't position it in the market, in the health system, then it has no value. So the first thing that you need to do when looking at creating a company is where would your product fit into the system? And as Al said, what is your product? What are the benefits to the physician, to the patient, and to the payers?
Absolutely. And when you think about that kind of end in mind approach, one of the things that I always find very interesting when I speak to folks who are more pure drug developers is that they're very focused on either the clinical pathway or the development pathway. But if you go very, very early stage, you're still worried about what is the core formulation of your product? How is the patient actually going to ingest it or get access to it? And coming up with some of the fundamentals and the realities of what it means to create a drug or a therapy that we're going to be bringing to market. And so coming more from the physician perspective, how do you think about the elements of kind of the technical components of building the product itself versus the development elements of proving that it's safe and efficacious and that it's going to actually create a benefit to patients? How do you think about that balance?
Yeah, thinking as a physician, you think how this drug is going to fit into your practice, right? Is it something that you have to inject, administer in your practice, or something that you just prescribe? And if it's just a prescription, how the patient is going to get it? Because if the patient cannot access that drug, it doesn't really matter if you prescribe it or not, right? But, if it's something that is administered in the office, in the practice, then you just need to see how it works, the flow in the office and how many patients are actually going to be able to help with that specific drug. Do you have to create a specific day where you're only going to administer that treatment, for example? So there are lots of things to think from a physician perspective. On the drug developer perspective, I think it helps that if the professional is not only a drug developer, but has actually walked the walk between the phase 1, the translational piece, to all the way to phase 4, working closely also with the commercial and the market access colleagues. Because then when you go back to your translational piece, to your phase 1, then you can incorporate all these pieces that are important to be developed early on.
Absolutely. But when you think about those things, Marcia, you're coming from a position of having had that early and that late experience. So bridging those skills seems very natural to you, having seen both sides. But most drug developers, or at least those kind of early in their career and might be doing this for the first time, have only seen either early or they've only seen late. So how do you think about even getting the skills at the table or asking the right questions to be able to bridge that if you've not had that lived experience on your own?
I mean, there are obviously courses that someone can take, right? But I would say that most people in the industry work by doing and work by seeing and by having mentors in the industry. So this is the most valuable piece of development. If you find someone who can take you under their wings and support you in your developing, this is really important. But you can also learn on your own by observing and just learning by doing. I think that's how I learned. And although I did take a course early on just to get started, but there's always someone in the company who knows more than you, and then you learn from them.
Yeah, absolutely. You can't be afraid to ask smart questions and leverage the resources around you to try to get these.
Yes, definitely. The people who learn are the people who ask questions. I don't think anybody should be afraid of asking questions. And this is what I usually tell people. There's no stupid question, right? Sounds cliche, but this is true.
Absolutely agreed. Absolutely. So one thing that we wanted to talk a little bit about today, Marcia, was this concept of the 5 Ps of company formation that we had spoken about in prior episodes. We had talked about people, product, patents, pennies, and place, and this idea of kind of the return to work. As you and I have kind of talked and reflected a little bit on that framework, having come from more of that company formation and that venture background, you had to come up with a few extra Ps, especially the one around patients and how we think about patients in that early day. How do you think about patients when you're at the earliest stages of company formation and you may or may not have a product fully formed yet and you don't have the pennies or the dollars to really worry about drug development? Most people don't really think about patients or patient advocacy until they're in phase 2 and they really have something to show for themselves. But tell me more about your opinions here. How do we bring the patient to the table even earlier?
Yes, I think that's one of the most important P's, I would say. In this day and age, there's no way to develop a drug without considering the patient voice. For me, thinking about the patient comes naturally because as a physician, I practiced for 10 years. So I always have that in mind. But if somebody has started their career in a lab, they may not have that direct connection, for example, with the patient. So I think it's important to bring that to inside the company. Some companies take that very seriously, particularly companies that work with rare diseases. And they create, let's say, patient councils, right, that get consulted as you're developing your clinical trial. But even if you don't have that embedded in your development, there are always opportunities to engage with patients compliantly, and engage with the patient advocacy organizations to get their input on the design of the clinical trials, on the endpoints, what are the issues that bother them the most. Because again, going back to the product, if it doesn't benefit the patient, you're not going to find a place in the market and the payers are not going to want to pay for it, right? So, and the patients, even if they're like specific regulatory endpoints, they are defined. If patients tell you that there are other things that they care about, you can develop endpoints around that, and that can bring you competitive advantage towards other products that are already in the market that didn't follow this process. If you listen to them, you're going to have not only the right design, but you're going to have increased retention, and they're going to want to stay in your trial and support the development. When the drug is before payers and regulatory authorities, they're going to want to go there and advocate for the approval of this. Obviously, if they feel like it has benefited them and will benefit people with the condition.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I maybe would push back on the idea that we can really have robust patient engagement before we even have a full product suite established. And when we're thinking about drug development, right, we're not quite at the thinking about how are we designing our trial and designing our endpoints, but even earlier stage than that. You don't have dollars in the door. You are fighting for your patent. We would always argue that the patient should be at the table, but I recognize that most founders, especially at this early stage, when they're not sure if they're going to have funding, they're thinking very scrappy, and they might meet a couple of patients around a table or caregivers, depending on the disease states that we're talking about. How do we think about bringing their voices even into the investor narrative to really build the burning platform for why there is a need to bring something in the market before we can even get to the stages of drug development that you're referencing?
Yeah, again, this is the benefit, right? If your product, let's say it can be a new drug in an area with a lot of unmet need. So sometimes the need is obvious, but sometimes the need is not obvious, right? If you have an incremental, drug, you may think it helps, but the patient may tell you that they don't care about it, right? So there may be scientific innovation. It may be beautiful in the lab, in your preclinical studies, but the patients are just going to say that they don't care. So I think it's important early on, even, when you're raising money, to kind of make sure that the unmet need is well defined. And if you can get at least a few patients heard, I think that is going to help in your positioning and your communication with your investors too,
Absolutely. And I feel like we have many conversations where we remind people that the investors, the health authorities, depending on who you're talking to, they're not living and breathing this exact disease state every day like you are as a founder or as, an early development team. And so there's a lot of education that has to come with that, especially for rare and ultra rare diseases where, they may or may not have a lot of precedence in their own personal context to be able to reference. And so it's important to bring these various voices to the table to define that unmet need and make sure that your product is truly unique and is differentiated, and that you can articulate that differentiation in a really meaningful way.
Yeah, it may also send you in a different direction, as I mentioned, come up with new endpoints. Once I was developing a drug for a blinding disease, and we started engaging with patient advocacy organizations and interviewing patients and having ad boards. And, if you're working on the blinding disease, you kind of think what the unmet need is. But eventually what came back was, mental health support, right? They wanted to understand. So that gives you an opportunity to eventually start measuring improvements in mental health. That's, a different competitive advantage that you can have. But I say competitive advantage, but this is because it benefits the patient, right? And I think that's important. And payers nowadays, they care about, if there is a functional benefit to the patient, not only something about a convenience, like a longer duration drug is nice for the patient, is nice for the doctor, but if you don't prove that it brings benefit to the patient or to the system, then it's not going to help, right?
Totally agreed. And so when we think about the product and this differentiation, we're bringing patients closer to the early company formation. We also talk a lot about this kind of smaller P at the end of the prior conversation around this idea of place, and that where you establish your company and the skills that you bring to the table, and whether or not these people are expected to be in the office or not, and how you think about those components is a really critical factor to building and designing a successful organization. And I'm personally sensitive to the fact that this is notably different between the US market and the European market. And that even within that, there's different geographies. So if you're in Boston and Cambridge, we know that organizations are heavily focused on being back in office. There are certain geographies throughout Europe that are very in-office based, but it creates this drain on talent to be able to bring the right skills to the right table at the right time. And so from your experiences, how have you seen this kind of move to the virtual environment and this now interesting hybrid balance of those who have kind of pushed this return to office versus those who have kind of retained a virtual structure?
I really enjoyed where we are landing, which is this hybrid option, right? When I started my career, you had to be in the office. There was no option to work remotely. And most of us who've been in the industry for a long time, you've relocated a lot, right? You just look at people, they lived in many countries, they live in many cities, and they moved around because you had to move for your job. And that has a cost, right? So that has a cost to your family. And I've seen people moving to work on a startup, for example, buying a house, and then a year later having to go back or move someplace else. So this has a cost that to people. But, and also it reduces your workforce because not everybody's willing to do that. But now the market is global. Your pool of resources as a startup is global. So people can stay put. And if the company plans right, there are opportunities to engage in person. And that kind of still brings that, collegiality and that friendship that develops, and it helps the work so much. But I enjoy working remotely. I think it works. I enjoy meeting my colleagues and going to the office. But I think, we're all humans. So we have conflicts. Our life doesn't happen between, after you leave work or before you leave work. It's just happening all the time. So I think this level of flexibility is very important for most people nowadays. And I think, it's also fun because you end up learning about your friends, your colleagues like pets, their kids when they show up on the calls. And, I think, it makes us feel more human too.
I totally agree. And maybe just to make a bolder statement, you didn't say it, but I'll put it out there. It seems like companies who aren't willing to have some kind of flexibility are at a bit of a disadvantage because they're not necessarily bringing all of the best potential skills to the table that could really benefit their product and their placement and all of the things that they know they need to do. But by being limited by place, given that people are less malleable to pick up and move their livelihoods, we're limiting the skills that really could be brought to bear. And it could be a bit of a disadvantage for some of this company formation.
Oh, definitely. Things move so fast nowadays, right? For somebody to move, particularly from one country to another, there are all sorts of complications, moving your household goods and visa applications and etc. If you can do that remotely, you start working, very fast. So, and it gives the company also the flexibility to add people, right? And if you work in early startup companies, you may not want to hire an army of people, for example. So you can have your contractors and your consultants, and they can be all over the world. So, you have access to this expertise, which I think is really valuable for early companies. Once I was working in a mid-sized company and we were growing, and I was given authorization to hire 13 people, which is a lot, but we were growing globally, at that point. So it takes a while to you need to work with recruiters, you need to screen, you need to interview, and then second interview and third, etc. So in 3 months, I had interviewed and I was ready to hire 10 people. But by the time the budget had changed, there was a hiring freeze, and I lost that, right? So, and I think this sort of agility that I think the world nowadays needs, that, having people remotely and being able to hire consultants when the time needs, have a business that is fit for purpose, I think it's really important.
I couldn't agree more. I think that's probably one of the most important takeaways, is to think about the agility and how you want to structure the organization from day one, recognizing that that could certainly evolve over time. And as you get to being a late stage organization, you're in phase 3, you have really strong data, and you're in a position to hire and build an in-office culture and evolve the company that way. What you do now doesn't necessarily need to be the end-all be-all, but that agility and the ability to bring the different skills to the table is going to be game-changing in the same way that you want to engage with patients and understanding, the patient that lives next door versus the global impact of the disease is going to also change the narrative for the organization. So really recognizing we're living in a global environment right now, and we really need to be able to bring the best skills to bear and be very flexible and agile in how we design and build these organizations.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is here to stay from a global perspective. Obviously, if you are in a big biotech hub like in Boston or in San Francisco, it is a little bit different because you have a lot of talent in that area, people who don't need to relocate. But I think in most cases, particularly in Europe, I think it's pretty common nowadays to have, people spread all over.
Absolutely. It creates its own set of challenges, but I think the benefits certainly outweigh the risks when it comes to the work that needs to get done in these early days. So,
yeah, definitely.
Marcia, my last question for you today is, as an emerging leader in the space, what advice would you give somebody if they're just at this early days of trying to set up a company? What are the most important things for them to worry about or be thinking about?
I think they need to be flexible. They need to be action-oriented, and they need to listen. I think a lot of this balance, I think it's hard to achieve. A lot of people start and they just start doing without really having a plan, and working with people who sometimes have not done that before and cannot gauge, cannot find that balance between something that is important or not important, versus speed and versus quality, for example, balancing scientific rigor with the need to move fast. So I think understanding this balance, I think it's key.
Totally agree. Everyone has heard it here. Balance and agility and flexibility is going to be the most critical foundational skills to be successful as a new industry leader. And I think that absolutely resonates with everything that we're seeing in the market. So, Marcia, thank you so much for joining today and for the great discussion, and looking forward to having you back again soon.
Thanks for tuning in to the Emerging Biotech Leader, an SSI strategy podcast. Join us each month for more conversations with biotech leaders. If you'd like to help navigating the complexities of biotech, reach out to our team at ssistrategy.com. Don't forget to hit subscribe and leave a review.